All right, well, thanks everyone again for joining us today. We'll get the webinar kicked off here. Well, today's webinar, we're going to take a look at the exciting world of NFV, looking at the standards ecosystem and look ahead at 2015. Joining us today on this webinar is a pretty star-studded cast of characters with lots of expertise in the field. Myself, my name is Dan Meyer. I'm Editor-in-Chief of RCR Wireless News. Also joining us today is Sue Rudd with Strategy Analytics, and Sue will provide us a bit of an analyst background on the NFV market. We also have Margaret Chiosi, who's the president of OPNFV and also a distinguished network architect at AT&T Labs, to provide a little bit of overview of the standards process and the organizations working on NFV. We also have Martin Taylor, who's a CTO at Metaswitch, to provide some insight from a vendor perspective on the market. Also, Ravi, who's the Senior Director at Hitachi, provides some insight as well. And also Peter Margaris, who's a Senior Manager of Product Marketing at F5, to provide his take as well on the NFV market. So this webinar is also tied into a report or longer story we just put out. Should be available on our website, the rcrwireless.com website, I believe later on today, looking at the NFV market. And kind of tapping into some of the, looking at what's happening in the market when it comes to, like I said earlier, standards, the ecosystem, and looking at 2015 to what's happening in NFV. Quick slide here on RCR Wireless News. For those who aren't familiar with RCR, we've been covering the mobile telecom space since 1981, back when it was just two-way radio communication. So we've been covering the space for quite some time, and obviously, as the market's been evolving, when it comes to the new technologies and virtualization, a new market we've been covering. So that's a little quick slide there for everybody. So we'll start off with, I guess, just an overview of NFV. And before I get to this one, I just want to kind of give a little quick overview on the webinar as well. The webinar will be 1 hour long. The plan is I'll do a quick overview of the topics that I covered in our report, so kind of a Cliff Notes version of our report. That'll bring us Sue on to bring a little bit of oversight on the market. Then Margaret will come on as well to bring some insight as well. Then involve Martin and LS and Peter to come on as well too. Then the plan is we're going to do a quick little roundtable discussion on some of the topics in terms of NFV. And then if possible, at the very end, we're going to try to leave some time for some questions from those of you listening in. So for those of you who are listening in, there is a questions tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel. And you can put some questions in there, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the webinar. If we are kind of tight on time and we don't get a chance to get to many of those, the questions will be shared with our panel members for a potential follow-up after the webinar too. So feel free to send those in, and we can get back to those to you on those at some point as well. So that's the kind of general plan for the webinar. Also, sometimes there's issues with being able to hear us clearly. I will say we will try to talk as loudly and clearly as possible. Sometimes there are some volume issues with certain computers, but hopefully everybody can hear us clearly. And if not, we are going to have this webinar on our website that you can re-listen to it again at a later date, and hopefully the volume issues might be worked out by then. So, but again, hopefully everything should be good for that. So again, back to the topic of NFV. So again, for those who don't know much about NFV, and those who probably know a lot more than I do about it, the basics of NFV is it's basically a decoupling of network functions into proprietary hardware appliances, so that those applications and functions can run as software on top of generic pieces of hardware. So the basics of this is it's supposed to allow for greater efficiencies and potentially cost savings for operators in running their networks, allowing them to just purchase software to run on generic boxes. Now, I do say theoretical on this because in doing the story, there is still some questions in terms of the actual cost savings involved when it comes to going to virtualization. I think in the past there's been kind of a thought that a lot of software and hardware that was packaged together by vendors perhaps had the costs associated with the development of those pieces kind of melded together, where when it comes to the development of just software pieces, that some of that R&D work will be hoisted, at least the cost will be hoisted onto the software prices. So there could be perhaps a bit of a sticker shock for some when it comes to the actual pricing saving or price savings when it comes to going to virtualization. But we'll see how that plays out moving forward. One thing I think was kind of interesting is when talking with one of the analysts on the story was Michael Thielander there with Signals Research Group, is as he said, NFV is perhaps the most hyped architecture of the past 12 months. So I think those of you who have been following the space would realize that 2014 was indeed a pretty big year, at least from a PR perspective, in terms of NFV. A lot of announcements that came out last year, so obviously a lot of hype surrounding it. I know those who've been working on the technology have a lot more history with it and been doing a lot more work on it, but it did definitely seem 2014 was a pretty big year in terms of NFV. So the need for NFV. Most of you probably already know that obviously mobile networks are currently being stretched to their limits by growing consumer demand for data services. This has forced a lot of operators to I guess, alter their past spending efforts. They're spending a lot more money now on spectrum assets to help bolster their networks. I think, at least here in the U.S., recent spectrum auction has shown the value of wireless spectrum. Operators have also been having to modify their networks using more advanced technologies, whether it's advances in LTE or small cells. That's also part of the new equipment being installed on networks as well too. So a lot of costs going towards kind of, I guess, meeting this consumer demand for data services. And also, obviously, the market was running a bit low on new acronyms, so NFV is a great new acronym to have in the market. Some numbers from the report. A lot of small numbers here. Might be hard to read, but you can also take a look at these. The webinar itself, the PowerPoints, will be available for download later. But just looking at the fact that obviously operators have spent a lot of money on their network equipment. One of the reports, Strategy Analytics, had mentioned that $700 billion have been spent on infrastructure over the past 10 years. So obviously, operators around the world have spent a lot of money on equipment, on kind of the standard legacy style of equipment. But that is probably going to change moving forward as operators start to look at the virtualization space. Infinetics had put out a report stating that they expect the SDN and NFV market to grow from $500 million last year to $11 billion in sales by 2018. So while still a small portion of the overall network spend, obviously virtualization is going to become a bigger part of the network going forward. As I mentioned earlier, 2014 was indeed a big year for NFV. ETSI, which is one of the main driving bodies behind the standardization of technologies, completed its work on the phase 1 of the NFV standard and began work on phase 2. Also, a lot of organizations were formed or got a lot of support last year in terms of working on the virtualization space. Companies or organizations like Open Daylight, OPNFV, et cetera. And also, a lot of companies announced some big investments in terms of virtualization. HP was just one example. They'd mentioned they're going to spend $1 billion on virtualization. So a lot of big money being thrown at the virtualization space, and a lot of companies getting involved in it. So a big year in 2014. 2014 also saw a lot of vocal carrier support for virtualization, which I think for most vendors was a very heartening thing to see. You know, in Europe, Telefonica, for example, announced some big support for it. Japan, NTT Docomo, SK Telecom also very big behind virtualization. And here in North America, AT&T late last year, I think most know, announced some plans to have 75% of its wireline and wireless operations controlled by NFV and SDN and cloud platforms by 2020. So again, a lot of support from operators, which is really helping to propel the market for virtualization. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations were tackling the virtualization space, and we'll get some more on this a little bit later from Margaret from OPNFV. But again, Linux Foundation has been very big behind this at open source, different types of platforms going with Open Daylight and OPNFV. The ON.lab is also another big one going on, and OpenStack are all tackling the virtualization space. Each one kind of tackling a different slice of the NFV pie, as opposed to perhaps ETSI, which is kind of looking at the bigger picture of things. But a lot of different organizations working on different aspects of virtualization. Some of the challenges for such a broad movement towards NFV. One thing that was brought up to some of the people I was speaking with for the story I worked on was, you know, there is some concern from some that all these organizations are working on pretty small slices of the overall pie. And so there could be some concern down the road about putting these pieces all back together again when it comes to creating a full NFV platform. Again, we're still early in the process, so a lot still to be worked out, but that's just one of the concerns that was brought up. Also, there was a concern about, I guess, the timing issues of the demand for virtualization for the standards process. It seems like mobile operators and telecom operators are being very aggressive in trying to roll out or at least get their hands on virtualization platforms. But we are still going through a standardization process, and so there's a chance that some of the platforms that come to market early could be perhaps pre-standard or not not to a standard that's set by an organization. So that could be a bit of a concern, though. On the other hand, there was a lot of talk from those I talked with that the market may need to kind of adjust its view when it comes to standards. That perhaps when it comes to at least virtualization, that a standard is perhaps not as important as it would be in other elements of the network. So we'll see how that plays out going forward. But those were some of the concerns that were brought up in the story that I put together on the topic there. All right, so with that, I will quit my rambling and bring on some real expert analysis on the topic. And so for that, first I want to bring on Sue Rudd. As you can see, she's with Strategy Analytics. She has a very long title there, so obviously she has got a lot of insight into the market of NFV. Has been covering this space for quite some time. So Sue, I would definitely appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for joining us. And we'll let you take it over.
I'd like to emphasize the point that Dan raised, but add a corollary that although we have had a lot of hype, I think the reality is matching the hype, which is a rare event. And what I'd like to talk about today, if you can go to the next slide, Dan, just to summarize the topic that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be looking at a very brief overview of what happened in 2014, what we see happening this year, how the operator focus has been shifting, and how the standards bodies are supporting that, running ahead of it, maybe running behind it. So let's let's start to talk about 2014. Very hard to summarize all the activities briefly, but I think we're in, if you look at where we are in the cycle of deployment, from the idea that came in 2012 to start NFV, which as you know is a carrier-driven initiative, and now brought under the ETSI umbrella so the carriers can work together without getting into antitrust trouble. We have a situation where we have really started to see not only lab trials and proof of concept, but we've actually seen some commercially capable equipment coming about. And that's why 2014 was a very exciting year. The market is still split between the IT purists and the telco realities. And so the examples I'm going to talk about here are where the two have been put together. But initial deployments in 2014 very much did represent the conventional IT world, where this was much easier to implement. The ideas that the Open Network Foundation had originally pioneered really apply very easily in the cloud and data center. So the low-hanging fruit, if you like, for deployment was server virtualization, which is essentially the original cloud concept, moving it into the higher performance telco cloud, and simplifying the back office operations, where AT&T and Deutsche Telecoms took their early focus. And then we began to see this year the commodity routers. Much of the early thrust was to be able to put a router software onto a commercial off-the-shelf Intel or HP or IBM platform. That's turned out to be more of a challenge than some people thought, although there is software running to get high performance. People have either been writing to the lower layer Intel DPDK with embedded code, sort of a little bit of Back to the Future. You want to write in this open environment, you go back to embedded code, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And then a couple of vendors, notably Alcatel-Lucent and Ericsson, have actually put real-time operating systems on top of the real-time Linux to really be able to get the fast enough interrupts to do routers. I mention this because this is one of the most fundamental concepts of NFV, is can you match network equipment performance with off-the-shelf hardware? Virtualized packet core took off very much, I think, as part of an easy way to deploy VoLTE. We saw the early trials in 2013 for demonstration, and then we saw real deployments in 2014, such that you could offer a virtualized VoLTE solution on a nationwide or regional basis from a single site, so that in order to deploy VoLTE, not all the IMS cores had to be upgraded. And this has proved to be a very cost-effective way to launch VoLTE. Virtualized CPE has been an area where Telefonica and a couple of cable companies have been focused to simplify the mess that they've got with the diversity, and at the same time they've actually been standardizing some of the CPE. There have been a number of really earth-shattering examples. One that I think we should watch very carefully is the ability for a country-specific operator like NTT to launch a global cloud service in less than 6 months. With the acquisition of Vertella, NTT really took the cloud services, including mobile roaming, and a lot of the mobile services can now be offered by any, especially the Tier 1 ISPs, on a global basis out of a single site or multiple sites. Virtualized RAN is one that's not quite there yet. We're going to see some announcements at Mobile World Congress about how to actually really virtualize frequencies, which is going to be exciting. But more importantly, right now in 2014, we're seeing multi-baseband units being shared on the same physical server and multiple radio access technologies. That's where China Mobile has been looking to pioneer virtual RAN. But it's coming. And some people thought it was a long way off, but I actually think we might see a lot of that in 2015. And then we have had early SDN controllers and the emergence of V-switches, which you will also see a whole bunch of those at Mobile World Congress. And then one that would surprise many people, which we would have thought would be some way off, is the ability to virtualize physical transport with optical bandwidth and frequencies and being on-demand capabilities configured by software to reduce the time to assign bandwidth. Probably the most real operator activity is what I call the dirty little secret of NFV, is that most operators actually are starting to learn the processes and gain some of the OpEx efficiency by virtualizing their legacy equipment. This, of course, is totally antithetical to the official standard story, but in fact creates probably a good percentage, maybe even as much as half of the OpEx savings can be captured by treating pools of legacy equipment as a virtual resource and being able to configure and dynamically assign them, so that operators are learning the processes at the NOC that they will need as we get to the truly NFV compliant platforms. And the first of the real services, which AT&T launched in December in Texas as an early commercial service, is the ability to request bandwidth on demand with user-defined networking, where an end user can actually provision their own service. It's provisioning an instance of a currently existing service so far, but ultimately the dream is to be able to provision new services. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what's been showing that's really proving how active the world has been in 2014. And I'm not going to go through this slide and the next one. But if you looked at the middle of last year, ETSI was talking about 18 proof of concept trials, and I managed to cram them on the page. And the importance of looking at this is just to see how many operators are involved on the right-hand side, as well as vendors. And I think you'll see the impressive list that we had as of last year when ETSI put out a summary report. But if we go to the next one, we're now up to 32 trials and even more operators and some new vendors showing up, some of the new pure bare metal platform vendors running on standard off-the-shelf software on standard off-the-shelf platforms, as well as the Linux vendors like Red Hat. And then we have Brocade, and we have a whole bunch of the component manufacturers as well, moving into this world. And you can see very real examples. And I think the most important thing to note about what ETSI has done is to really pioneer getting practical examples being tested. And many of these are not truly ONF compliant, and they've been demonstrating them at various conferences in Europe, and hopefully there'll be more that we'll see at Mobile World Congress. But we're going to see real examples of really operating applications, and many of these are in fact being used in the operator networks and then being put into a multi-vendor interoperability framework by ETSI for some of these proof of concept trials. So let's look at what we see coming in 2015. And the operators are really looking to move some of these into commercial trials, and some of our vendors today hopefully can talk a little bit about that. But the ones that we see coming from last year that I mentioned, virtualized enhanced packet core, virtualized IMS with VoLTE, SIP interoperability for voice over IP, by the way, being the other side of VoLTE, where you can have VoLTE and VoIP interoperability to get a larger footprint for your AMR codec. Virtual access bandwidth, as I mentioned, that's going to be one of the most basic applications that uses the ability to request different bandwidth, but merging that with LTE carrier aggregation is something I think we're going to see. beginning to virtualize the RAN, virtual firewalls, and virtual CPE. I won't go through the list of real examples, but you can see here we're starting to see the early real examples where operators and their customers, both particularly enterprise customers, are going to get a lot of the early benefit. But there's some big challenges we're going to deal with this year, and this gets back to the point Dan was making about are we slicing it too thin? To date, most of the focus has been on virtualizing elements like the EPC or the RAN or elements of the RAN. But what we are now seeing is the true ONF model whereby we don't just have appliances or element level functions. We actually decompose those into the functional elements of the actual service level logic. And those are called virtual network functions or VNFs. And that's really the guts of the ultimate service opportunity here, where we can decompose and mix and match those virtual network functions and create new services on the fly. However, if you talk to any of the vendors who are operating those today, to define VNFs, even on their own platforms, is a major architectural challenge. So I think we're going to see a lot of effort starting this year, but it's going to take a while to really define the virtual network functions and then allow them to be mixed and matched into new services. Probably the lagging opportunity that we're finally talking about is the brownfield interoperability. If you look at what all the major legacy vendors have been doing, in fact, is offering interoperability versions where their new off-the-shelf standards equipment can interoperate with their legacy install base. And of course, as Dan mentioned, there's a huge install base out there. And the standards bodies are starting to deal with this, and that'll be a major focus of both ETSI and OPNFV that is really going to make this real. Some of the forgotten areas are the good old network management and real-time OSS. Network management is actually moving into an active function, probably one of the more exciting areas. But unless we resolve some of the standards for how to deal with both legacy and new equipment with standardized database mapping and so on, we're not going to move forward very rapidly. And to go forward, eventually, we're going to need something better than our traditional lab trial approach. We're going to start to need libraries of these VNFs, have policies for interoperability testing. Maybe we defunction some of the interoperability capabilities that are too hard to test initially. But we have to go beyond just putting all the equipment and software in a room and allowing it to interoperate. We're going to actually have to start doing theoretical simulations on a much larger basis. And finally, probably the biggest issue I've run into, and you'll experience it if you stand next to some of these wonderful new bare metal platforms running software, is while the performance may be getting closer, it's maybe as close as a factor of 4, maybe even a little more than that compared to the proprietary equipment. A factor of 4 is slower to date, but moving up there. But energy consumption and heat dissipation are huge issues that have to be dealt with on this commercial off-the-shelf platforms. And the bigger vendors like IBM and HP have been dealing with that, but the off-the-shelf Intel platforms still have a ways to go. So let's go to talk about where the operator focus is shifting. And there's been a major shift from the early CapEx savings focus. People thought that off-the-shelf hardware must be cheaper, but it hasn't turned out to be that much cheaper when you integrate all the systems that go with it. But the big savings turn out to be from the configurability and the ability to spin up resources on demand, and that shows up with better capacity utilization, which in turn translates into deferred CapEx. So the CapEx savings come out of resource utilization. If you move from 40% utilization to 60%, that's actually a 50% improvement in the utilization of existing platforms. So the OpEx savings lead to CapEx savings as you spin up new equipment. And I won't get into all of the new areas that operators are looking at, but suffice it to say that performance, availability, matching all the 5 nines capability, and then matching all the interoperability to avoid the vendor lock-in and provide the services, new service provisioning, self-provisioning, And all the organizational processes that go with the elimination of silos of applications are going to take us 5 years or even more. So the operators are beginning to focus on it, but it's going to be a long time before we actually get through this process. But it's an exciting time because we're going to be changing a lot of things. And by the end of this year, I expect the focus to be much more on services and value added that operators can add with these new capabilities. So let's just talk about how the standards bodies are changing to help these capabilities. The Open Network Foundation last fall added an operator council, or it moved it up to a higher level to really deal with the issues that telcos were putting on the table. And I think there's still a danger that ONF could actually be a bottleneck to final standards, and that's where OPNFV maybe is going to help, as well as some of the ETSI activities. But it's very important that ONF be aligned with what is happening on the telco side, with true carrier-grade SDN, enterprise capabilities, data center migration of a telco cloud standard. So the rest of the standards bodies, if we look at the next slide, we'll see that the good news is that ETSI, with its phase 2 goals, is really looking at the interoperability of these systems. We're starting to look at how do you really run a multi-vendor NFV. How do we specify reference points, not just the interfaces, but actually the functionality that's exchanged between these network elements. And then how do we manage these end-to-end flows, I think is going to be a big issue. And finally, and I just wanted to put in a word for software-defined networking, with SDN can probably take place with the separate control plane without necessarily moving to true NFV standards. But NFV virtualizes all the resources, but they can't be allocated without the control plane. So we're going to start to see the intersection of how SDN can actually manage and allocate and optimize all those resources be a very hot topic in 2015. And the two projects, particularly Open Daylight, which is a vendor-driven project, but which is probably pioneered making real products that operators can actually relate to and see how they can come together from multiple vendors, has really made a lot of progress. And then there's the Open Network Lab, the OnLab, that Dan referred to, which is a more independent test lab, and some of the operators are really looking to work with them to some degree because they are truly independent of the vendor community. And so let me now look at OpenNFV, which was started last fall. Let me hand it back to Dan to introduce Margaret to discuss that.
That sounds great. Sue, definitely appreciate the great insight there. And for any more follow-up for anybody listening in with Sue, here's some contact information for Sue right there. Again, always great insight from you, Sue. Definitely appreciate that. And thanks for the helpful segue there to bring on Margaret. Margaret Chiosi is the president of OPNFV and also works at AT&T Labs. Margaret, thanks again for joining us today. We definitely appreciate it, and hopefully get some insight from you now on OPNFV and kind of how these organizations and standards bodies are really working to really propel and I guess at point unify kind of the NFV ecosystem. So thanks again for joining us today, and we'll get to your slides here.
Okay, Sue did a great summary since I've been in the beginning of all this from 2 or 3 years ago. So the goal of OPNFV, when we go to the next slide, is actually to provide an end-to-end integration environment for all these different slices that Dan had said before. When we were involved in the ETSI's GNFV, the goal that ETSI did was it created a common framework and common lexicon, and then the POCs were very useful for showing the industry how real this was getting. But it wasn't supposed to be just for carriers. It's really any user who wants to virtualize their network function or any function, and there's a certain basic type of framework you need. So you could be an enterprise company trying to do your VNFs, your routers, and so forth, and you have the same needs. They're not any different. The difference is just happens to be we had a lot of carriers that got focused on this. And as we were working the whole ETSI NFV, we wanted to get to implementation faster because a lot of us were in the middle of trying to deploy things. And so we couldn't wait for the normal documentation that goes with standards and the discussions, the papers, and so forth. Because usually once you have the standards, once you have a document, now you have to build. So we started investigating the open source arena and that's why we created OPNFV. So the goal is really to create an environment for us to test an end-to-end platform for a VNF. Our goal is to create an open platform so that we are not dictating exactly what all the combinations are, but to provide an environment so that you can actually pull it together, validate it against certain types of use cases, and then go from there. Our goal is to have the user community, not just the carriers, participate in this. The goal is to contribute to open source projects once we find gaps, whether it's bugs, minor gaps, or whether it's major fundamental functional features that are missing. And the goal is to then create the open source and then to upstream it to the appropriate open source projects. So again, like I said, to create an ecosystem based on open standards and software, and then hopefully OPNFV will be the right platforms for folks to basically instantiate their VNFs on. Our initial focus has been on what the ETSI organization created. This shows the bottom of just this piece, but as we go further along, you'll see that it's a little bit more broader than that. Why don't we go to the next slide? Again, our goal is to work with standards bodies like ETSI and others to figure out what code, as we're coding our interfaces, how we should do the coding, also to work with all the different upstream projects. So when this whole ecosystem started, we're finding that to truly have and utilize an SDN controller, if you virtualize it, the value proposition of SDN controller becomes more real. When you don't virtualize your network functions, all PNFs, the controller helps, and it helps basically maybe replace some of the things that your OSS does, but the real value doesn't become real until you virtualize, because once you virtualize, then you get into the concepts of scaling out, scaling in. You get the concept of moving or moving your application around for different reasons, and then once you're scaling up or scaling in, then the traffic that's directed to that application now has to get moved around. And so that's the value proposition of the SDN controller, to start moving the network traffic around to meet that application, wherever that application is. So our goal is to create a platform that basically does end-to-end integration of like the controllers, the hypervisors, the orchestrators, the cloud orchestrators, and then other things as you see here. Our goal is to leverage the existing code base, as much as possible open source, but to really create a common framework so that if a certain set of functions are really more in the proprietary path, or it's a combination, there's some open source, there's some proprietary or vendor specific, that we have a platform that you can drop these different variants in, and you don't hopefully have to reinvent and re-architect the whole platform. So I'm going to go to the next slide. This at a high level just shows the different life cycle of our different projects. And because we're a combination of architects, requirement folks, as well as coders, we're realizing there's 4 sets of types of projects that people are going to gravitate towards. One is basic documentation. The other is the requirements of what you're trying to do. The third is the integration testing of making this work, and the fourth is the collaborative development. So for example, if you come up with a platform that you've developed and so forth that works, well, you won't really know whether it works unless you have very specific use cases. That's really where you get this integration and testing. So we're defining use cases that are like maybe 2 types of tracks. One that's focused on performance. This is where you get into the DBDK, the OVSs, and are you getting the throughput you want. So for that, nuances a set of traffic profiles. Is it working as planned, or are there real major gaps to get us to the throughput that we need? The other area is functional types of testing to make sure that the VNF that's actually running on this platform still works. And maybe the third is functional testing in the sense of you're going to instantiate a VNF, and so you want to make sure that the platform that we've created actually will support the instantiation of the VNF. Okay, next. Now this tries to show the projects that are in works at OPNFV. We started last September, and we have a lot of projects already, and we try to group it in certain types of categories. So we have things like automation, fault analysis, carrier grade types of features, tools to help us in building, and there's, I mean, you sort of see the different tools and so forth on the left and right. Now, the blue shows the different types of open source pieces, and this is not like everything. It's more of a community of folks that have decided they're interested in this type of combination. And so as more and more companies join that have a different set of combinations that they want to put in this platform, so to shake out our build scripts and so forth, and to help shake out the test environment that we're creating, then this will expand. I'm trying to think what else. Well, I mean, it's too difficult to go through everything, but there's things like we're coming up with the use cases to do the testing, we're coming up with benchmarks, we're coming up with tools to validate things and so forth. Okay? All right. Go to the next. And then the final slide is these are the types of companies. We have platinum and silver, and you don't have to be a member to participate. We are actually encouraging the industry, whether you're an enterprise user, whether you're a carrier, whether you're a cloud provider, to join if you're really focused on virtualizing a function, and then related to that, there's network connectivity, then you're really probably going to be solving similar problems that we're solving in this organization. Okay.
Great. That sounds good. And again, like you said, too, I mean, you guys just started up last September. So again, a fairly new organization still, but it seems like you guys are very busy, at least in the process and getting things moving along. So
yeah,
sounds like
so
a lot
things like
happening there.
Owen Lab, when they create their version of an SDN control like ONUS, they actually have asked to work with us to basically have that part of, you know, a certain function in our platform to help shake their end-to-end integration and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Very good. Well, great. Well, Margaret, we definitely appreciate the insight on that, and I know we'll get back to a little bit of the standards issues and kind of the organizations working together in the roundtable part a little bit later on in the webinar here. But next, I wanted to bring on Martin Taylor, who's a CTO at Metaswitch, to provide a little bit of a vendor insight and kind of what Metaswitch is doing in the NFV space and kind of how it views itself as part of the ecosystem. So, Martin, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Can you move to my first slide? Great.
There we go.
Okay, so a brief introduction to Metaswitch. We are a software company fundamentally. We've been in business for more than 30 years. We have about 300 customers who are OEMs who've licensed our communication software for deployment inside physical network functions. But we've also been supplying telco-grade systems, and I'm talking physical network functions, network appliances now, for about 15 years, and we have about 700 customers in the network operator space. So we're experienced, and we are very much specialists in the field of communication software. Now, our view is that NFV really fundamentally changes the landscape for vendors into the network operator community. I mean, traditionally, network operators have been served by network equipment providers. But of course, the NFV world is all about generic hardware, standardized infrastructure, and the network functions are implemented as pure software. So network equipment providers really, now need to morph into network software providers, and we've been a network software provider really all of our existence, and we see ourselves as very much first among a new breed of vendors that have this very strong software focus. Two areas of functionality that we're delivering, first being virtualized network functions in and around the IT multimedia space. So I'm talking about IMS, IMS core session border controllers, telephony application servers, media gateway controllers, all of that type of network functionality. And secondly, software-defined networking solutions for data center and NFV. So I'm talking about lower down in the stack, the networking substrate, programmable software-based networking substrate on which NFV functions operate and run. Okay, let's go to the next one, Dan, please. So just a few words about our activity and history in the NFV and SDN space. And I think we make the claim here that we were a very early mover in the NFV space, and a number of proof points here. Firstly, we actually demonstrated a virtualized network function back in February 2012 at Mobile World Congress. That was about 9 months before the Network Functions Virtualization white paper came out, which actually coined the term Network Functions Virtualization. We were also, before that NFV paper came out, already architecting and building network functions specifically for the cloud. And that's our project Clearwater, which is an open source implementation of IMS designed from the ground up for the cloud. That was selected by the very first proof of concept project that was approved by ETSI, the Cloud NFV proof of concept. About a year ago, AT&T announced the first tranche of vendors in their Domain 2.0 initiative. 4 vendors were named. We were one of them. So we were recognized by AT&T very early on as an early mover in this space. We announced our hyperscale data center networking fabric in July. We got a very early production deployment of a virtualized network function, a carrier grade session border controller, BT. We think that's probably one of the very, very first real virtualized network functions deployed in a production network carrying traffic at scale with a tier 1 network operator. And finally, we were one of the founding members of the Open Platform for NFV, and we're very active participating in that activity. So enough from me. Back to you, Dan, to introduce the next speaker.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. Definitely appreciate it there. Great. Ravi, who's with Hitachi, maybe provide a little insight there from Hitachi's point of view.
Okay, all right. So I think both Sue and Margaret provided us a great introduction, and I think I can't but strongly concur with Sue that this is one area where hype has really started to meet reality. Just to give a little bit of background to everyone on this webinar, Hitachi Communications Technologies America is actually a subsidiary of the larger Hitachi group companies. We are a Texas-based development team with over 1,500 man-years of experience, person-years of experience in actually developing and deploying carrier-grade solutions. Hitachi actually acquired this asset, the packet core network, from Nortel in 2009, and we basically do considerable development in the virtual EPC space. We are actually committed to OPNFV, and I did hear Martin tout some of the benefits that basically Metaswitch brought to the table with their first implementation of an NFV solution in 2012 at Mobile World Congress. Hitachi as well did demonstrate a fully functional MME, which is a fairly complex beast, to the world in 2012 MWC. Again, we do have multiple solutions in our virtualized mobile core solution suite. One of the things that we realized back in 2010 when our MME was commercially deployed to a large operator in Japan, NTT, was that we needed to actually make an architectural change to go to a full NFV kind of an architecture. So we, unlike many other companies, took the view of actually decomposing a very complex piece of software, which is the MME, and made it actually work as a true VNF. So Dan, if you can actually go back to the previous slide, I'd like to point out some of the architectural differences. What we did was we actually broke out all these separate functions which are in an MME so that it could give us better control and scalability. And as Margaret pointed out, some of the challenges that most of these apps face is in not only scaling up, scaling down, scaling in, scaling out, but actually moving functions. So one of the things that we were able to do through our Puritan view of actually decomposing a very complex beast was to actually allow us to scale on multiple axes. We are also a provider of VNF, which basically works across multiple hypervisors. We've actually released a number of press releases on the different platforms that we run on. And we have actually got even our management platform, which runs as a VNF, on basically hypervisor. If you can actually go to the next slide. What we do is basically through this approach, we are providing most operators a simple single point of presence to fairly complex network functions. The way we scale things is based upon the need rather than basically monolithic scaling. So if there was actually signaling that had to be just scaled, that single element could be scaled by itself. We have fully adopted and committed to OPNFV. So essentially all our protocols, all our interfaces are completely open, and we actually run on whatever platform basically the operator chooses to run on. Again, this is proven telco-grade, carrier-grade application that we've got, and it's in several prominent trials with tier 1 operators all over the world. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Dan.
Great, thanks, Ravi. Appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time and staying with us on that. And also, it sounds like we got Peter, I think, back on as well. So perhaps we'll go to Peter, who's the Senior Manager of Product Marketing at F5. Peter, are you available there?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. That's a great tagline, too. So, yes, we can hear you now. So, yes, so yeah, maybe talk a little bit about F5.
Yes, certainly. If you can, I don't know if you can please advance. Yes, the F5, we're a company that has been providing various solutions to service providers for a number of years. We're based in Seattle, and we do provide a combination of purpose-built, high-performance platforms for service providers' use, and a market leader really in providing layer 4 through 7 application services to service providers that include various traffic management solutions, solutions that help address control plane and signaling challenges for service providers, as well as multi-layer security solutions across layers 4 through 7 in various that address various different security issues across multiple footprints within service provider networks. And lastly, working with service providers and leveraging all our solutions in participating with their various NFV use case scenarios and evolving NFV initiatives. So we're participating actively in standards, both ETSI and IETF standards. We have a breadth of VNFs available, and this is leveraging from our traditional solutions that we do provide service providers. All our solutions are available in both purpose-built platforms as well as in virtual editions and as VNFs, deployable as VNFs, and supporting a wide range of service provider network models and business models and evolving NFV use cases. And we also are working with partners and integrating our solutions with third-party partners and actively involved in customer engagements across all of the theaters in the world in terms of leveraging these solutions to drive some of these virtual network business cases. Next slide, please. So all of our virtual network functions, you can see, are enabling service providers to deploy as plug-and-play elements as virtualized network functions, and we are working with partners who are providing orchestration elements to be able to leverage these VNFs and repurpose these solutions on the fly, and also evolving all of our solutions towards supporting service provider evolving requirements and new evolving business models that are going to tie into cloud-based scale and service delivery.
All right, perfect. Well, great, Peter. We definitely appreciate the insight there on that. Go to the panel discussion at this point. Maybe try it that way there. Obviously, for Sue and for Margaret and also for Martin too. I mean, obviously some great insight into the NFV space. And I got to say, one thing as I was working on the story is, we did look a lot at the kind of the standards process that's been happening, and obviously, I think you all kind of mentioned the fact of the importance of kind of these organizations working together, whether it's ETSI or OPNFV. But like I kind of mentioned early on, I mean, obviously it does seem like a lot of the organizations are slicing the pie a bit thin. I guess how are these organizations working together? Maybe for Margaret to kind of, since you are at OPNFV there, you kind of mentioned a little bit about working with ONUS and different organizations on the NFV platforms. What's, I guess, the general view of how the collaboration is working between the different entities at this point when it comes to really kind of trying to nail down what NFV can do and what it will be in terms of how it helps the telecom market?
Well, that's a loaded question.
I know you guys have
well, the reason why I say it's a loaded question, when this whole thing came up with SDN and NFV, well, NFV is obvious what it is, but SDN isn't. It's all over the place. And so you've got different, I would say, consortiums or standard body open source going down one path, and then you have another group going maybe down a different path. But one thing's becoming pretty apparent. People are realizing code is helping us basically move away from slideware and paper to actual implementation. People don't have time to take 5 to 10 years to get this to work. Everyone's moving quickly now. So now that you've got some groups moving more toward open source, they're recognizing, oh great, like you said, they're focused on a certain slice, and they're realizing, great, now I have to integrate with OpenStack, or now I have to integrate with a hypervisor. It goes on and on and on. And so you find we're all reinventing the wheel. So the OPNFV seems to be slowly finding a niche, I would say. Like we were involved, the TSC was involved in the OpenStack Paris meeting with the telco working group, and they were saying that they needed an end-to-end integration lab to test all these other, not only to integrate OpenStack, but also with other pieces that were outside of OpenStack. And so the TSC on the OPNFV side said, well, guys, this is what our mantra is, so don't try to reinvent that, start working with us. So yeah, there's definitely areas, well, like I said, the own lab folks approached us, so we've got to figure out how we fit them in. The Open Contrail has proposed a project, so they're actually part of that. That's what that Oscar thing was in there. And then we've got, ONF just announced they're going to create some sort of open source organization. They announced it, I think, yesterday or this morning. I've lost track now. I guess it came out this morning. So whatever open source functions or slices get created for us users, it's not sufficient enough to have a slice, right? The whole platform has to work end to end. So I think the industry will just have to come together because one slice is not sufficient enough.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And maybe from Sue, I guess, you talked a little bit earlier about, potential bottlenecks in the system. I mean, could this issue here become a potential bottleneck where, again, there's this big rush from operators to roll this out, but it still seems like there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to make sure it's all, finalizing and actually work out in an actual environment. Is there potential for a bottleneck situation with this work going on behind the scenes?
I think the good news is that the vendors and the operators are racing ahead. VMware is not truly standards yet, but they have versions that are, and so people are using what exists to get the concept. And in fact, there may be an advantage to actually implementing a practical version. This is more the way IETF has done standards. You get a version working with multiple vendors, and then you iterate it to do the truly pure standards compliant version.
Now, we're almost out of time in this 1-hour webinar. Somehow that flew by much too quickly. I did want to, I know we've got quite a few questions that came in. I hate to shortchange any of those. So what we might do with the questions is we'll just share those with our panel members offline, and they can follow up with those who sent those in offline as well. So we definitely appreciate those being sent in. Just a little tight on time here to get to many of those. But before we signed off here, I did want to just, give one quick round the horn to everybody. Maybe just looking ahead to 2015, or I guess we're in 2015 now, so to this year, I guess maybe one thing you guys see happening this year as being an important movement or important part of the evolution of NFV. Maybe just a minute or so of what you guys think going ahead. So maybe start with Sue. Maybe Sue, I guess I guess the 1 minute thought on what you think 2015 or the important, maybe an important aspect of NFV going ahead in 2015 might be.
I think number one is interoperability. I think many of the people have been implementing NFV in a monolithic fashion, and without interoperability, the operators will not achieve their goal of being able to have a choice of vendors and avoid lock-in. So that's number one, I think, for 2015.
Yeah, that's a great point there. I know the people I've talked to for the story did. That was a big part for them too. So I think that'll be big to watch. So, well, Margaret, maybe get your point of view. Maybe what you see going ahead. Obviously, I know OPNFV has been very busy, but what do you guys see happening? I guess over the next 11 months now as being maybe a big part of the NFV environment.
I think to shake out the whole thing related to OpenStack and a controller, whether it's an ODL controller and so forth, to truly shake out who does what. Right now, sometimes you have the orchestrator, the cloud orchestrator do things, the Neutron, sometimes you have the SD controllers do it, and there's tension there. So I think between all the different implementations that are going to happen this year, we're going to hopefully get closer to reality of who the roles and responsibilities of these different pieces.
Got it. Yeah, definitely a little reality might be good, but that sounds good. Well, thanks, Margaret. Appreciate that. Maybe go to Martin now. Martin, maybe get from your point of view what you see happening over the next 11 months or so.
Sure. I mean, we see network operators absolutely not waiting for standards, not waiting for specifications, recognizing that most of the moving parts they need to start building services based on NFV are available today in one form or another, and going right ahead and as they build out new capabilities in their networks, doing that in virtualized form rather than doing it with physical network functions. The work going on in ETSI and OPNFV is great, and it will all help the whole process moving forward. But no one is holding their breath waiting for it.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a good point too. It does seem like operators are moving ahead pretty quickly on this, so that's going to be the challenge for everybody. But that sounds good. Well, Ravi, maybe get your view of the next year or so when it comes to NFV.
Yeah, so when you look at the area that we actually play in, we see that basically operators are getting fairly innovative with well-behaved NFVs. So essentially, if you look at what operators want, they want to actually address some of the things that basically Sue pointed out in terms of brownfield opportunities. For instance, they want to try a combination of things like an MME and SGSN and maybe few things that basically augment maybe the S5 optimizations on MMEs and so on and so forth. So in that area, we see a lot of innovation coming in from the operators, posing, basically challenges which can be achieved by a combination of NFVs which are actually well behaved and can actually, integrate well with the orchestration scheme. So we're seeing a lot of that happen.
All right, that sounds good. And Peter, final word from you on what you see happening over the next 12 months or so.
Yeah, well, I think that we certainly have seen a lot of activity in the past year in terms of a lot of technical validation, and I think now I'm progressing forward, especially with ETSI Phase 2 and service providers now looking to do more broader scope POCs that will bring in OSS, BSS, operational elements, and do a lot more business model validation, and even work towards evolving their business processes at the same time to really leverage some of these deployments to see some of the true operational benefits.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds very good. Well, great. Well, Peter, we appreciate the time today. And thanks again to all of our panel members for some great insight. Obviously, this is a topic that can be discussed for hours and hours on end. I think we've just kind of maybe just barely scratched the surface on a lot of these things. But again, you can get some more insight on the story we just released on this. You can get on the rcrwireless.com website. It should be available, from what I've told. It should be available now on the website. So you can download that there. There should also be a replay of this webinar on our website here maybe the next 24 hours or so. It should be up. And also, I definitely recommend everybody check out Strategy Analytics. Go to the OPNFV website, check out Hitachi, check out F5, and check out Metaswitch for some more insights also on the NFV topic. Because again, there's a lot going on in NFV right now, and it's going to, as many have said, going to revolutionize the telecom market. So a lot happening, and we're still in the very early parts of it. But I definitely suggest you check out those companies and organizations too. Well, again, thanks again to the panelists for joining us today for the great insight, and thanks for all you listening in. We appreciate it. Thanks again.